In recent years, Ruth has been an invited project musicologist for the ASEAN Contemporary Music Ensemble and also several contemporary music festivals. She maintains an active performance career and is a member of the Philharmonic Orchestra in Singapore, on which she also serves as a chairperson of the committee. And she recently co-founded the Southeastern Ensemble for Today's and Tomorrow's Sounds, SETTS, which is a contemporary music ensemble advocating Southeast Asian composers. So I will leave it to them to introduce the topic and lead the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank the institution, Untitled, for inviting us to come here. I've been told I have to use the microphone. I feel a bit awkward. It's such a small venue and so few people here, but it's for the recording, so I need a third hand actually to turn papers. And there will be latecomers, I suppose, and I'm not quite sure who our audience is, but I want to give you sort of a brief introduction of what to expect in the next hour. Thank you, Ruth. That actually frees the hand. Thank you. I've been asked to give a brief sort of conceptualizing introduction, which I've titled, How Can We Sing the Old Songs in a Strange Land? Conceptual Challenges and Open Opportunities for Musicology in Southeast Asia. But really what we want to do here in that context is to introduce you to Ruth and mine really endeavor to create a Southeast Asian chapter of the Royal Musical Association and to invite you to share your ideas and to see how we can make that work for you. The chapter has existed for a year and a half. Ruth will give you a brief summary of what we've done, what the mission is, forthcoming events. So, and we're also hoping that we'll have a lively discussion after this. So that will give you hopefully the opportunity to become involved in the next stages of this intercultural, interdisciplinary, intercontinental endeavor. And what I'm going to say actually fits in quite well with a lot of things we've heard today, yesterday. I wasn't there on the first day. Unfortunately, Jeffrey Sharkey, for example, talking about us all being students for life and embracing the traditions of others with humility. And Anata yesterday saying we have to identify and connect voices. We're trying to do that between the UK and Southeast Asia. Both Ruth and I are musicologists. We're aware that this is a conservatory and that musicology is sometimes regarded with a bit of suspicion, but that's okay. Let's embrace diversity in this regard as well. So my little introduction will come from a musicologist's point of view and hopefully summarize some of the discipline for you before we can bring it to the present day. Is musicology an irredeemably Western, even an inadvertently colonialist endeavour, I want to ask? Can it have any real relevance other than as an imported curiosity to music education understanding in Southeast Asia, an area of much older and deeper musical traditions than the relevant recent 19th century German origins of musicology itself? And of course, I am German, so I'm a part of that tradition. Today I would like to pose these and other related questions in order to facilitate discussion on the uses and potential abuses of musicology in a Southeast Asia context, catalyzed both by the current conference and by recent experience of setting up the Southeast Asia chapter of the Royal Musical Association. From the subsequent discussion might emerge some answers to a final question: how might we forge a distinct Southeast Asia musicological identity, and would we wish to do so in the first place? What I would now like to give is a historical context that might inform our further discussions. Many music students, and indeed musicologists in the West, and of course these musicologists should know better, think of musicology almost, or indeed explicitly, as an empirical and demonstrable science. Indeed, the German word for musicology, as quite a few of you will know, I was surprised how much German was being spoken here by the students. Musikwissenschaft means the knowledge or the science of music, specifically designates it as such. By this definition, there should be no question of whether musicology is important or indeed appropriate to a Southeast Asian context. Musicology is the empirically verifiable science of music and therefore applies to all music, whether Western, Southeast Asian, Australasian, Siberian, or even Martian, should we discover that microbes on Mars have a musical culture. So coming in your direction in the next century, probably. What I would like to suggest here, however, is what we usually refer to as musicology in Europe and America is far from an empirical science. It is largely culturally contingent, historically predicated, dependent on a tiny repertoire, and a repertoire, moreover, that shows distinct national biases, and could in fact be considered as much a branch of propaganda, of the reinforcement of social elitism, or a tool of naked national objectives that our beloved, but perhaps fictitious scientific inquiry. This is not a mere prejudice, I believe, but in fact can be justified from the very origins of musicology itself in a Western context. These origins were distinctly German and notably nationalistic. As we probably all very well know, the first musical biography, in the sense that we normally consider musical biography, was probably, anybody knows the answer of this? What's the first musical biography? The first musical biography? No? Well, it's Nicholas Forkel's biography on Johann Sebastian Bach of 1802, so more than 200 years old now. Forkel's agenda was openly elitist and nationalistic. If we today have any misunderstanding about the purpose of music history, then it's certainly not down to Forkel. He declared that the purpose of his biography was to celebrate Bach not only as one of the greatest composers of musical history, by which, of course, he meant Western musical history, specifically European musical history, for any other type was unknown to him, but to place Bach as first among equals in the pantheon of great German composers. Bach's achievement would be an ornament to the fatherland, a fatherland which, of course, had no concrete existence at that time in a political sense. It was all the more important, therefore, to constitute a virtual reality fatherland of the German spirit, a cultural paradise in which the German-speaking realm could celebrate its unity in great art. From these auspicious and distinctly tendentious beginnings, 19th century musical biography took root. In general, followed a similar pattern. The strategy remained twofold. To justify the place of the biography subject in the developing canon of great Western art, and concomitantly its place within the burgeoning standard repertoire, and usually along with this to extol the subject's place in the cultural life of his, and it was universally his and not her, nation. It is not surprising, therefore, that the other side of this equation, the standard repertoire, within which these great composers were expected to operate and whose productivity was necessary for the standard repertoire to exist, were also largely, if not exclusively, German. In the 19th century, also, several publishing houses began to issue complete works of those composers considered ripe for canonization. In some instances, these volumes were described in German as Denkmäler, which means monuments of German art. Again, the propagandistic purposes are naked and unashamed. These editions of complete works are, of course, well known to us, for they are on the library shelves in many university musical departments and musical conservatories to this day. And I'm sure some of you can name me some examples. Which of these composers were first canonized by complete editions, sort of starting in the mid-19th century? If you go down to the music library, or even online, the International Musical Score Library Project, yeah, give me an example. Beethoven, okay. Who else? Anybody else? Handel, Bach, Dittersdorf, are you sure? Not sure about that. Robert Schumann, both by his wife, and Johannes Brahms. Who else do we have? Dittersdorf. So these are some of the few examples. And these scores are even predominantly available and used in the International Music Library Score Project, available online and used by most of us a lot of the time. Why? Because they are naturally no longer in copyright, and although their editorial standards might not meet modern musicological requirements, their price certainly meets the needs of the average musician's budget. So despite the fact that for most of these pieces, much more scholarly, valuable editions are available nowadays, we go back to these mid-19th century editions quite a lot of the time because they're available easily online in digitized format and for free. Of course, it was musicologists, our supposed scientific, objective, bias-free group of individuals, selflessly working in the interest of science and self-defined great art, who chose the composers suitable for inclusion in the complete editions. For inclusion, a composer obviously had to work with music that was or could be notated. Well, yes. Vast swathes of performance repertoires throughout the world, probably the large majority were therefore automatically excluded. Even a composer such as Georg Friedrich Handel, George Frederick Handel, in the English-speaking world could occasionally cause problems owing to what Donald Francis Tovey described as Handel's irritating tendency not to actually write down his music. He was, of course, referring to largely improvised harpsichord preludes, entirely improvised solo sections in organ concerti, and the like. Therefore, an initially German and soon-to-be pan-European project even necessarily excluded from consideration much of its own popular folk and performance-led music. Music had to be carefully considered and notated by a distinct personage known as a composer, who may also have been the performer, but was not necessarily so, in order to achieve canonic status. Naturally, concomitant analytical tools were also developed, tools that by and large were well suited to the analysis of notated tonal and indeed sometimes merely German music. That type of analysis was, of course, the analysis of music as notation, and rarely the analysis of music as an oral effect. Music, moreover, was either entirely or largely improvised, was of course resistant to such analysis, and would have been considered too ephemeral, as indeed it by definition was, even to deserve analysis of this type. So again, entirely written, notated music became part of this analysis. Even more laughably, some subsets of analytical types, such as Schenkerian analysis, were devised almost entirely on the basis of 18th and 19th century German Austrian music and derived their measures of quality from this music. As a consequence, many types of French music, such for example the so-called impressionist music of Debussy, or music of a much more loosely goal-oriented structure, such as Italian opera, was not simply unsuited to analytical measures of such as those, but was specifically categorized as bad or incoherent music because they did not fit the analytical method. Thus, a laughably circular argument was created that is still regarded by many today as self-evident truth, which may be summed up as something like Donizetti is good, Beethoven is bad. The other way around, I'm sorry. Donizetti is bad, Beethoven is good. I'm thinking ahead, yes. No, Donizetti is the bad one. Don't you forget that. That's new, I know, I'm jumping ahead. Donizetti is bad, Beethoven is good. We all know this. We may indeed think that Donizetti is bad and Beethoven is good. Yes, there we go. But if we do, it is unlikely to be able to be justified by the application of Schenkerian analysis, because Schenkerian analysis, like most forms of propaganda, already knows the answer before you have asked the question. Therefore, Schenker, just like Forkel, had nationalistic purposes in mind. And to be fair, neither were particularly secretive about their purposes. Neither was another famous composer, Arnold Schoenberg, when he confidently, if delusionally stated that his newly developed 12-tone system of composition would, and I quote, ensure the supremacy of German music for the next 100 years. hasn't quite happened that way. Such historical points would nowadays be of mere passing interest were it not for the fact that many music history, musicology, and music theory courses in Western conservatories or universities are still fundamentally based on them. Although it is true that great strides have been taken in recent years to extend the ambit of musicology to recognize its Eurocentric origins and to develop analytical and historiographical methods that might be applicable to other repertoires or indeed to music without actual repertoires at all, there is no doubt that these steps have been halting and far from universally taken. We now, of course, have what we amusingly call ethnomusicology in order to deal with the social and cultural history and anthropology of music out with the classical European tradition. Ironically, this so-called subset probably represents 90% of the world's music, as you will be well aware. We might rather say, in fact, that European musicology is simply a subset of ethnomusicology and invert the entire value judgment on which the former was predicated. It is nevertheless true that we also come to realize not just the small range of our Western musical culture, but also the vast oceans of other musical cultures, and come to acknowledge that these cultures have traditions often much older than Western traditions, sometimes just as regimented and equally valid. We can no longer justify the colonialist attitude whereby other types of music are considered exotic color that might occasionally be added to an essentially Western tradition or might constitute short, fascinating, but nevertheless hardly central musical holidays from the main matter of musicology itself. So where does this leave the idea of Western musicology in Southeast Asia? And where indeed does it leave the recently formed Southeast Asia chapter of the Royal Musical Association? In some respect, it might be considered by some to be an old-fashioned, pointless, and indeed, even if unintentionally so, colonialist endeavour. We had several council meetings where the older generation said, don't do this, it's colonialist. And some of us saying, well, we have to do it because we're post that, we're doing something new and we have to do it differently, actually. There's no doubt that the roots of the Royal Musical Association are similar to the roots of collected works of great composers in the 19th century. In that the RMA was necessarily originally a Eurocentric endeavour. It was founded in 1874. However, the RMA does now embrace not just awareness of, but an active desire to make links and build bridges with other musical cultures. Not only outside the Western tradition, but also what they call performance as research. That's a new keyword in the UK at the moment. The RMA is trying to open up to performance traditions, to composers, and move away from this musicology-centered focus. When we set up the Southeast Asian chapter, our hope was not just to make a small contribution to the deepening of the professional study of Western music in Southeast Asia, for we were, of course, well aware that not only were many Southeast Asia music teachers and professors closely acquainted with Western music, but effectively now form part of their own tradition, and that many of them have been trained in Western universities and conservatories too. Rather, our attention was both to learn from Southeast Asia music and to act as a catalyst for further multicultural and intercultural development of music. I freely admit that I do not know exactly what form this development will or even should take. However, I would like to ask the question, both of the audience and of colleagues who are not here today, of how we can cross-fertilize musical training, musical education, musical practice, and musical analysis in a world that, as the cliché goes, is increasingly and irrevocably global. And naturally, the cliché is a cliché because it's undeniably true. European musicology cannot help what it was. It was undeniably propagandistic and nationalistic in origins. It can, however, help what it is and what it will become. I personally would like to see the divisions between ethnomusicology and musicology, and indeed the very recent and, in my view, harmful division instituted in America over the last decades between music theory and musicology itself disappear. The understanding of all musics inevitably evolves the understanding of theory, practice, history, sociology, and anthropology relevant to the music. The subdisciplines cannot be fruitfully cordoned off from each other. They can only be impoverished. Likewise, knowledge for Western musicologists of improvisational practices and repertoires in Eastern music can illuminate our knowledge of similar, sometimes forgotten historical practices in Western music. We are all ethnomusicologists now, as Bruno Nettel once famously wrote. We should also all be musical theorists and analysts as well as historians. It is of course impractical and naive to expect everybody to be everything, to be all things to all people and all repertoires, and equally responsive to all musical repertoires, to be performers and composers, scholars and teachers all together, although some of us may manage it. What we can hope for and require, however, is an open mind. It is with this open mind that we set up the Southeast Asia chapter of the Royal Musical Association, and in some respects we do regret that the sheer antiquity and indeed establishment connections of the society inevitably give it a somewhat Eurocentric and old-fashioned air. Nevertheless, we can contribute our expertise, just as you and others can contribute yours, to broadening the base of mutual knowledge. Of course, Southeast Asia does not need a chapter of the RMA. But to be perfectly honest, Britain doesn't need the RMA either. Concepts of necessity are, in my view, rather irrelevant here. We should rather be, I think, asking the question, can such organizations contribute something useful? They do not need to be essential, merely advantageous, whether in a major or minor way. This conference today is another valuable attempt in bringing musicians together in shared artistic and scholarly endeavors. The conference, the RMA, the AMS as well, and indeed musical guilds, fraternities of groupings of whatever sort throughout the world, are merely vessels facilitating human interaction between those interested in the subject at hand. Like all vessels, they can be filled with something enticing, imaginative, and nourishing, or merely with hot air. I'm sure that we all know which of these options we'd prefer. And it's of course our role as colleagues to try to ensure that we facilitate the result with tolerance, initiative, and an open mind. A conference such as this here is a wonderful opportunity for shared interest and shared endeavors. There's no shortage of hot air elsewhere on the planet and in other walks of life. That is one element that we need not produce ourselves, and that I'm sure our subsequent discussion will strictly, even ruthlessly, avoid. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and will now pass the platform over to different, perhaps even much more stimulating perspectives than I have myself. Move over to pragmatic ideas, activities, and a short summary of the Southeast Asian chapter before we open the floor for contributions and hopefully a fruitful discussion. So thank you, and over to Ruth, who is the convener of the chapter. She's based in Singapore, which makes it easy. I'm the organizer based in the UK. We've collaborated a lot, and Ruth has kindly summarized some of our activities and a mission statement and other things, and she'll introduce that to you now.
Okay, so thank you, Monika. Just like to introduce myself. Sorry, I just moved the stand so I can see some of you, all of you. Hey, so I'm Ruth. I come from Singapore, and firstly, I would like to thank Arnold and the staff of this very institution for inviting me to this conference. It's been a very stimulating past few days, and I've learned a lot, and it's really good to be among this community. So with the RMA Southeast Asian chapter, I've been thinking about all the keynotes from the past few days, and it actually resonates a lot with what the RMA Southeast Asian chapter is about. So we talked about community and collaborative learning. We talked about dialogue as well between practitioners, between researchers, between educators. And of course, Professor Lenski also talked about ancient flexible mode in reference to Debussy. And of course, with Debussy, with the trio, the inspiration came from the 18th century itself, very much like the RMA, but it's molded itself and it's now taken on a national identity within that classical form. And I see that very much with this chapter. And of course, Professor Mark talked about misunderstandings. It's a key word that often happens in musicology, happens in this part of the world, especially when we try to put things within a very Western context. And then with Dr. Arnold, she talked about connecting our voices, and that resonates the most with me because I work in the community as a researcher. I'm also an educator. I teach music in a high school in Singapore. And I'm a performer, as you heard just now. And I work with a community of composers who are also very good friends. And therefore, we all find a commonality between all of us. So I find that with the Southeast Asia chapter, why it came about is because I found the need to connect all of these people together. So the RMA's Southeast Asian chapter, we have a mission that breaks down to 3 very simple points. And the first is to bring together music practitioners in performance, composition, and musicology with music educators in Southeast Asia. Next is to actually deepen and enhance the musical scholarship in the region. And lastly, to widen the reach of the RMA by hosting annual events in Southeast Asia. So what has happened so far is that in April 2015, we had our inaugural conference with the support of the RMA as well as the National Arts Council in Singapore. And the topic was a very simple and obvious one. It was just West meets East. We were very privileged to have Professor Dieter Mark, Professor Mark Everest, who was the previous president of, he still is, yeah, right, okay, of the RMA Council, and Dr. Arnold herself, to give 3 keynotes touching on just 2 points of this topic, which is Southeast Asian music from a cross-cultural perspective, as well as music in a society reproducing Southeast Asian performing arts. So for this conference, we had a very vibrant range of discussions, including composers and performers who were there to present on their work. We had composers talking about how they brought in their own native dialects, and even we had a showcase performance on the site where Western instruments meet with Eastern instruments, and together it collaborated to perform student compositions. And this year, we continued the trend of topic, and we performed, the topic was on performing traditions. And this one was more focused on performance, where we investigated on the mutual influences of traditional and classical music, as well as to explore the understanding of methods, aesthetics, and theory, widening the possibilities that emerge when combining performance traditions from the East and West. So this year we had Professor Jeffrey Benjamin from the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, who is actually a sociology expert, and he presented a paper on indigenous Malay music. We have a few people here who were at the conference, Professor Shah, for example, and it was very vibrant, again, a very vibrant discussion where many different cultures came together. Now, this year on the site as well, I felt, because following the feedback from 2015, we found the need actually to widen the appeal of this whole chapter to students. And as an educator, it's something that I really believe in, that if we want to groom musicologists or to get students to think analytically or to even write about music, we need to start from the ground up. And I feel that as a high school teacher, I'm actually in a perfect position to do this. So we engage the students of the music elective program in Singapore. So these are students who are taking GCSE O and A-level music. And they came down for a study day, again hosted by the RMA. And it was just very simple, just about writing about music. So we started from 13 years old onwards to get them to think, how do you critique music? How do you critique a concert? How do you actually write program notes? And in the end, we also had focused works from their curriculum, and expanded on those topics and to get them to think about musicology from a very different perspective. So for this one, we had actually 162 students from 11 schools, and the feedback was quite positive, and we're very encouraged. So we would like to continue this study day, and if I dare say, we could actually do similar study days in various countries as well. So I touched upon research and educators. The next one is actually on performers and composers. So the RMA very recently has started to engage composers into their activities. And as mentioned just now, I co-founded the Southeastern Ensemble for Today's and Tomorrow's Sounds. It sets ensemble with Mr. Christoph Wichert, who is the bassoonist from Singapore Symphony Orchestra, and he hails from Austria. He's actually also faculty of the woodwind department in this very institution. So SET was actually founded exactly a year ago. We're 2 weeks to our very first birthday, and we've already done 3 concerts as well as a composition lab. So with the 3 concerts, we really focus just on Southeast Asian contemporary music, trying to engage with the composers and getting the composers to work directly with the musicians themselves. So my role, although is to manage the ensemble, and I always joke that Christoph is the brain and the body of the ensemble, and I'm the head and the legs, because I manage the things while he curates with the performers the concerts and comes up with the concepts as well. But I feel that my role as a musicologist, as this ensemble evolves, is to actually document and to write about what's really going on in this region, because there is actually a lot that is going on, but I feel there's not enough scholarship, or not enough being put out there to document all of this activity. And with the composition lab that took place this year, we had 15 musicians, 15 composers and visual artists, or artists of various disciplines, working with the composers together in pairs to produce new works as part of a lab. So Dr. Arnold and Dr. Ho Chong-shi here were the composition mentors, and this is also a project we hope to continue in years to come. So this is where we want to engage composers, and not just musicians, but also artists of other disciplines. Because again, I feel that as musicians, we are very insular, and we need to really look outwards towards the other communities. So with this year's conference, we had a think tank session, and these are some ideas that were thrown out by the conference participants, where we asked what they want to benefit out of the RMA, and what can the RMA possibly offer to scholars or musicians, practitioners of this region. And so they asked for institutional membership, so staff access to resources such as JSTOR, society membership, so if you have a composer society or you have a certain ensemble, maybe you could also apply for membership. Membership for creative artists, so composers, personal reflections to be shared on the website. So we already have a RMA Students Council blog, right? So that's something that students could actually add to. Again, possible study days for scholars and students. So we already did a study day this year in April. We will continue it next year. Publications to be hosted on the RMA website. And very interestingly, was thrown out as well to get scholars in indigenous music communities interested in the chapter, because they are often the most unrepresented lot in a way in terms of scholarship. Working with CDOM, as well as e-journals through the RMA website. So possible future events that we could have in this chapter is a Southeast Asian chapter session at the next RMA annual conference, which will be held in Liverpool in the UK from the 7th to the 9th of September. Potentially it may clash with Anotai's 4th edition of this conference, but we shall see. A student study day, very similar to the music elective program study day that I ran in April this year. That will be held possibly around the same time again in 2017. And we've also started to talk with one of the participants from the conference this year, who actually is from the CS University in Xinzheng, it's in Henan province in China. So she's very interested to try and get some kind of conference going for Southeast Asian practitioners in her university. So before we talk about events, just let me highlight to you that you can actually join the RMA. We have application forms here, and the staff of PGVIM, his name is Boss. So Boss will show you, he's showing you where the table is. Now we'll put the application forms there later. You can also join online. And one of the chapters, accomplishments this year was to have a restructured RMA membership fee to reflect different income and economical situations. So there is actually an option in the form itself. So just let me show you where the website is. So that is the RMA website. It's rma.ac.uk, and you it's actually quite an extensive website. You can read about its activities and upcoming activities. It's actually got a lot for students and plenty of study days that one can take part in. And to join the conference, to join the RMA, you just have to fill up an application form online as well. And I think you can also do payment online through PayPal. Okay, the internet is not quite working. Yeah. So, but I mean, going back to the think tank and the future events, perhaps now is the time to brainstorm and to hear from you what we might possibly be able to do for you and with you.
Thanks very much, Ruth. One very practical request that I came here with was from the student representatives of the RMA, whom I met at the conference in London last week, and they want to establish contact with students in Southeast Asia, and they want to possibly conduct interviews, blog about you, set up partnerships. So if there are any student members here who are interested in connecting with students in a similar situation in the UK, come talk to me. I'll happily take your name and put you in touch with these student representatives, and they will follow up, and hopefully that'll be one part of our collaborative endeavors. So come talk to me. I'm looking at the people that I think are students. Yes, yes. And other than that, we're now inviting your ideas, requests, comments on the whole undertaking. Who wants to go first? Thank you. Microphone, but it won't hurt.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Institute, Kun Jing, president of the Institute, also Anutai, for organizing this event and for giving us the opportunity to learn, to share with one another. And over the past few days, I have observed, and I really, I am very, very appreciative of the fact that the panels are set on and organized in such a way that we learn from our elder brothers and sisters from the West, and the issues are Southeast Asian or Asia, like Professor Moro mentioned this morning also, that we can help you, we can raise the question, but the issues and not really problem, the issues and concern are yours, and you have to find the solution to address those concern and issues. And the other thing that I really appreciate very much, I see it, for example, Professor Dieter Mack mentioned about the humility, and he gave the example that after I learned 1 year, I lecture, and after I learned 10 years, I stop lecturing. And that is the respect, and it's very important in humanity and in human being, kindness and I see that all our elder brothers and sisters have shown that compassion. While they are doing all this, they are coming here to help, and we learn. And the other thing is that I would like to raise to my fellow Asians is that there are also discussions and views about how we are moving forward from now. We learn from the past, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. In fact, for example, the RMA and musicology as such, we have to learn, because as a formal system, as an empirical science and all that, we have to learn. In fact, these activities and these things and knowledge have been passed on from generation to generation over the years. In Cambodia, Angkor Wat, 12th century, we already had many musical instruments, cow already, the celestial dancers, 1,737 already cowed, proving or attesting to the fact that those things actually existed and happened before, except we have not done that systematically. And me, I am like Professor Morrow also, I'm not an either or approach person, I'm an and person, and looking more on the positive side. If the society, if the system is musicology itself brings us benefit, we should do. I think we have to caution ourselves though, is that, I think perhaps with the lack of the word is that, do we want to be a Western gorilla? You know, we follow the system, but we should do something that is relevant to our situation. In Asia or in Southeast Asia, we are talking also about understanding our own term, using the Western system as measurement, as checklist. But we have to understand ourselves through the study and understanding of our own terminology. And because there are some feeling also, for example, the title is On the Strange Land. Sometimes we feel that when we say strange land, and the people who live in the strange land are strangers. And I am reminded in anthropology that we should avoid the word strange, the word weird, the word exotic, because according to whom? You know, Columbus discovered America, how about the Native Americans? Or Henry Mahut discovered Angkor Wat. How about the people who live around Angkor Wat? In fact, even on the compound of Angkor Wat, what happened? I think this thing is very difficult. Now the state of Washington already replaces Columbus Day with Indigenous Day. You know, all of these things that we have to, I think as Asian, we have to take our own lead also, as we have to grow up somehow. And then we learn from the best, but we have to find our own voice that is dear to our heart. In short, I think these things that we can benefit, and we are very thankful that you came and then you gave us the, the views, the ideas, the system, you are willing to help. And the world must be coexisting. And connecting voices, that is the main theme of this conference, and we really appreciate that. And thank you very much for being here and give us all of this. Thank you.
Thank you for this, but I'm hoping it's going to be a dialogue. You know, the West desperately needs to learn from people here, because you think about music so differently. What we heard last night is a different way of doing a concert in a conservatory. I think that would be very unusual in a Western context, and I find this inspiring and enriching. I think look, you do that in Lübeck? You do? Well, except for Germany. Should talk for the UK. So thank you for that. So we're hoping that the chapter that will encourage this dialogue in both directions. And we're coming here, but we're also hoping that some of you will come to the UK and share your experience there. We're trying to enable that.
I think you made a about the use of the word strange, but you can correct me if I'm wrong here. That's an adapted paraphrase from the Bible. How can we sing songs of the Lord, songs of Zion in a strange land? And it was basically a sort of ironic reference to concepts of music out of place. I take your point that nowadays we use concepts foreign, strange, or things like that. But because that was the quote, that was I think you'll correct me if I'm wrong.
No, so it's fine, of course, yeah. But your point is a very valid one, and yeah, we can choose other words, maybe replace strange with something else. No. But if for the general discussion, the idea, yes, we need to change our conceptualizing of this. Do we have any other ideas, suggestions, requests? What would you like us to do in the chapter? Yeah.
One thing that I think is really interesting is the RMA is like a pretty big platform, right? Yeah. So I would hope, or one thing I would be very interested as someone who's new to the region, is to see research that comes out of this region on the music of the region represented in the RMA, both for people internationally and also for people who live and work here too, so that it's sort of seen side by side with other musical forms.
If the internet would work, we could show you that the chapter has a distinct part of the website that needs to be filled with life. Some colleagues suggested that we should use that as a depository of writings or compositions from the region to make them accessible to other people. So that's a very good idea. And if you want to contribute or come on board. We need help. It's just Ruth and me pushing this forward at the moment, and other people joining us. But yes, come on board and help us make this come to life. Any other ideas, suggestions, comments? I'm sorry. Yeah, please. Have the microphone.
First of all, sorry to be late. That's right. But it's really just to reply. I think that we're in an even more extreme situation. I think that much of the planet has lost its cultural innovative energy, and that Southeast Asia and this part of it has it. So it's not, I think that as a leadership role may come to this part of the world. For example, what Anatai did last night, yes, we were working on in Scotland, years ago, but didn't get it quite there. The place that she's put it, related to the community work in that way and developing young musicians. So in a way, yes, there are certain things that can come from Western tradition that may be of use, but I put the case more extremely. I think we're in a point where maybe we should be looking to leadership from the optimistic, inventive environment of ASEAN. So we're looking for reverse imperialism now. Yes, I think.
Yeah, well, yes, good, all good. On that note, yes, you've heard that we're planning a session for the Liverpool conference. If you would like your name to be included in the call for papers, leave your name somewhere, even if you're not a member of the society. So we're hoping to see a group of you in Liverpool at the conference next year to make this a two-way exchange. Yes, and that can be the start of the reverse imperialism. Yes. Any other comments, contributions? Yes? Ruth.
I think one more thing as well is that if any of you are educators and you would like your students to connect with other students, not just in the UK, but within the region, I think it can be done. We just need to plan and really put our resources together to think through this, because in speaking with my fellow colleagues in Singapore, there is really a need for our students in Singapore to reach out to students within this region. I think it's to put it very strangely, to break down the walls, because we did it with the ASEAN Contemporary Music Ensemble. Chong Shi, myself, Arnold, Dieter, we worked with students from this region, and we've seen the good that's come out of it. not just in terms of friendship, but in terms of learning and sharing. And I think that's very important as an educator for me to feel that my students actually reach out to other students within this region and to grow together as a community.
A very good point, and let me say once more, there's funding available from the RMA for study days. So if you want one of these study days to happen in your region, in your institution, apply for the funding and the RMA will contribute, which is great. It's a great offer that society has made available. Anything else?
Actually, I have a question for musicians or music students, music scholars in this region. I mean, as Monika so succinctly summarized the origins of musicology in the West, kind of. I'm just curious, like, is there a parallel kind of thing going on in history in this region where communities of music practitioners come together to talk? I'm sure there must be something of a similar, discipline. May not be called so specifically with a name like that, but I always wonder. I mean, even as an educator, like part of teaching itself is musicology in a way, right? How we pass knowledge of music through words, through writing, down through the generations. So I'm not sure. I mean, again, we are like this morning we talk about music at education institutions and things like that, education system, and we kind of make references and we take a lot of framework from the West in that sense. But I personally am very interested in our traditional, the guru system, perhaps. I'm not sure. I mean, any of that kind of overlap with what Monika said earlier about the need to maybe objectify music. Maybe it's not the right word to use, but to really talk about music beyond the sound aspect even. I mean, I actually am very interested to hear from the practitioners here.
You're going to turn into musicologist any day now if you keep thinking along that line. Anybody want to address that? Where to start?
Hello, I'm Esther Siagian from Indonesia. I'm an ethnomusicologist. Indonesia, previously we have a project to collect and to learn about traditional music in Indonesia and put into high school and secondary school as a project, initial project actually to influence formal curriculum for students in Indonesia. And there is a project, I think Dieter Mark know it, Pendidikan Seni Nusantara, and we collect so many videos, and we do some series of course discussion about that, and there is much data about Indonesian music in our metadata that collected by Pendidikan Seni Nusantara, or like Nusantara art for the education, especially in ethnomusicology approach. And if you want to find it, I could give some address if you want to look for that. Unfortunately, actually, we don't have any endowment to go through it, but still we do not. I myself didn't add that project anymore because I have already have attacks in Jakarta Institution of Art, but some friend from ethnomusicology department and some friend who did that research actually still have so many data if you want to learn about Indonesia traditional music, and there is a metadata you can find it in tikar.com maybe. So there is so many information about Indonesian music tradition.
If you want to share that, send us the information. We can happily put it
Yeah. I just will go to who responsible to that project, endorse one actually, and we used to have grant from Ford Foundation to collect it. There are huge of data of music and dance or theater, traditional theater Indonesia in our collection.
That'd be very useful, yes.
Yeah.
I think we probably need to. Right. Do you want to? Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much for this wonderful discussion. Thank you to both of you. It's been really wonderful. I'm afraid we've gone a little bit over time, so we'll have to leave it there for today. But I hope we can continue these discussions more and informally and yeah, over food. I mean, that's always good. And so thanks again to everyone. And please let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you.